Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's in-person and online program titled Unholy Sensations, a story of sex, scandal, and California's first cult scare. My name is Kevin Kosick and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all and host the program this evening. Now, for those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to join, to donate, to find out more about the book club. Whichever you want to do, go do it online or come talk to one of the staff here this evening. Tonight's program, as I said, is titled Unholy Sensations, a story of sex, scandal, and California's first cult scare. Our speaker is Joshua Pattison. He's an author and the Associate Professor of Instruction in the Department of History at Texas State University. Josh's research focuses on race, ethnicity, and religion in 19th century America, especially in the American West. His first book, American Heathens, Religion, Race, and Reconstruction in California, was published by the University of California Press in 2012. His second book, Unholy Sensations, a story of sex, scandal, and California's first cult scare, was published by Oxford University Press this year in 2025, and that is the subject of his talk this evening. Josh received his BA from the University of Oregon, his MA from San Francisco State University, and his PhD from UCLA. Tonight, Josh will be talking about Unholy Sensations, a story of sex, scandal, and California's first cult scare. Unholy Sensations explores an international 1890s sex scandal that surrounded the Brotherhood of the New Life, a multiracial spiritualist community in Northern California. In his book and in his talk this evening, he takes a close-up look at the scandal to examine religion, gender, sexuality, and race in the Gilded Age from a fresh perspective. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please wait till the end of the presentation. We have time to take questions from you here in the club rooms and from you out there on Zoom. You can use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom, and we'll curate your questions and those from here in the club room at the end of the presentation. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Joshua Pattison.
Hello. I'm really excited to be here and talking about my new book. And it, as Kevin just said, it explores a sex scandal that rocked California in the 1890s, out of which emerged the modern notion of the cult. When we think of that word cult today, a lot of things probably come to our mind. We might think of a strange, small religious group that have weird ideas. We might think about a brainwashed group of followers that are controlled or abused by an authoritarian or violent cult leader. But like everything else, the term cult has a history. And the word cult didn't actually mean what we think it means today before the 1890s. Prior to the 1890s, when people used the word cult, it didn't have all those negative associations yet. In the English-speaking world, the word cult simply meant religious devotion or veneration. And it wasn't until the early 1890s that the modern, more negative ideas of the cult emerged. And the word cult in its modern sense did not come from Protestant ministers or politicians attacking small religious groups, as you might guess. It came from the media. It came from urban newspapers that were competing to grab readers with sensationalized stories about shocking American religions. And from the very beginning of the word cult's modern existence, California was strongly associated with cults. Long before Jim Jones or Charles Manson, there was Thomas Lake Harris, the first so-called California cult leader, and that is Harris on the cover of my book. So what I argue in Unholy Sensations is that newspaper coverage of Harris in the 1890s created the category of the cult in the public imagination. Harris became the first and prototypical cult leader, establishing a pattern that we still see today when we think about cults. So in my time today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Harris and his movement, and then I'm going to tell you how he became the center of a sex scandal in the 1890s, and then I'll end by reflecting a little bit about the term cult and why it's so fascinating today. So here you can see Thomas Lake Harris. He is an obscure figure today, but he was one of the more polarizing religious writers of the second half of the 19th century. Walt Whitman, Arthur Conan Doyle, William James, and many other people studied his writings about spirits and heaven and the unseen world. Thomas Lake Harris grew up in Utica, New York, during what historians call the Second Great Awakening. So that would be a period of the 1820s and 1830s when there were a lot of religious revivals happening across the United States, and a lot of new, innovative religious movements were born, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thomas Lake Harris was right in the center of the Second Great Awakening, and when he was age 15, in 1838, Harris went to a revival and had a born-again experience. And he decided to devote the rest of his life to the ministry. And he joined a Protestant group called the Universalists, who believed that there were no souls sent to hell, that God would not damn people to hell for eternity. And some Universalists said there was no hell, and others said there's a hell, but even if you're in hell, after you die, you still have a chance to be redeemed. You can still repent and go to heaven. That's what the Universalists believe. This is pretty radical for the 19th century. Harris was hired by a Universalist church in New York City, but he soon abandoned his pulpit to join a new religious movement that was springing up after 1848, which is spiritualism. Spiritualism is different than spirituality. Spiritualism is talking to spirits, to ghosts, to dead people. And you're probably familiar with the seance, the medium who can communicate with the dead. This was a very widespread and popular religious movement in the second half of the 19th century. Millions of Americans dabbled in spiritualism. Harris was no dabbler, though. He threw himself fully into spiritualism, especially after he was visited by the spirit of his dead mother and a dead sister. And he became one of the most prominent trance poets. So he would enter a trance, and then he would dictate long, bizarre poems that detail his journeys to outer space and the planets and heaven and hell. A lot of the spiritualists of the 19th century were scientists of a sort. They thought of themselves as investigators. But Harris was the mystical side of spiritualism. He was the poet. He was interested in the erotic as well. He claimed to have a spirit wife that he called his counterpart, and her name was Lily Queen. And he said that he had sex with Lily Queen. And he wrote many racy poems about Lily Queen. For example, he wrote in one poem, quote, "In communion sweet, we learn to share unspoken thought and ecstasies divine." In another poem about Lily Queen, Harris wrote, quote, "I began to glow in her sweet presence. My head on her translucent breast was pillowed. I trembled as a dewdrop." According to Harris, everyone had a counterpart. Everyone had a soulmate in heaven that you could commune with. So he encouraged sex with a counterpart, but not here on earth. Here on earth, he said that you should be celibate. I have a quote. He said, quote, "When a man is no longer entangled with women, he begins to long for a social kingdom of God." And over the years, Harris's ideas got wilder and wilder. So he saw and communicated with fairies, for example. He spent a lot of time battling demons. He called himself a pivotal man of creation. And he was destined to help a remnant of humanity survive the impending apocalypse, he believed. In the 1850s and 60s, Harris traveled extensively throughout the United States, and he went to Western Europe as well. And he gained a group of followers that he called the Brotherhood of the New Life. This included people from the South, the American South, and the American East. It included people from Scotland and England and Japan, interestingly, which I'll come back to. His movement was never large. At its peak, the Brotherhood of the New Life had about 100 people in it. But they included a lot of wealthy people from New York City, London, and Edinburgh who turned over their fortunes to Harris. And so during the US Civil War, Harris founded a series of utopian colonies. These are socialist, communitarian farms, basically, in New York State. Members of the Brotherhood of the New Life were all expected to reject coercive bonds and worldly concerns. They were all supposed to labor equally, except for Harris, in the labor of the commune, and practice celibacy, at least officially, right? Officially, they practice celibacy. In 1875, Harris took his most devout followers from New York State and moved to California. And he purchased 2,000 acres in what was just north of Santa Rosa in Northern California in 1875. And he called this final colony Fountaingrove. And you can see here one of his followers, a woman named Alice Parting, who lived at Fountaingrove. She was a trained artist and a painter, and she painted this image of one of the very, very opulent buildings at Fountaingrove. Harris bought the 2,000 acres for about $50,000 in a series of land purchases. In California, his movement dwindled to about 30 followers. They lived in gender-segregated housing, and they grew European wine grapes, which Harris sold as Fountaingrove wines. So Harris had an arrangement with the Union Pacific Railroad where they transported his wines from California to New York in specially refrigerated train cars. And Fountaingrove boasted one of California's largest wine production factories, a 3-story steam-powered, state-of-the-art brick factory that could make and store 600,000 gallons of wine. And because Harris had supporters in Europe, Fountaingrove wines were the first Sonoma wines sold overseas. And it really helped establish Sonoma as a top-notch wine region. Now, of course, for Harris, everything was spiritual. So these were special wines. They'd been visited by spirits. And he said that they had so much divine aura that, quote, it would be impossible to cause drunkenness by their use. So feel free to indulge. So from 1875 until 1891, for about 15 years, Harris and his small group of followers in Santa Rosa grew their wine and kept to themselves and mostly escaped notice. until 1891. And it is this woman, Alzire Chevaillier, who would precipitate the scandal that broke out. Chevaillier is herself a fascinating person. She was from Boston and New York City, and she was a socialist, a reformer, a woman suffrage activist, and she had studied Christian Science with Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science movement in Boston. And she had read Harris's poems, and she was fascinated by his insights. And she wrote a letter asking Harris if she could spend the summer at Fountaingrove. And he said, sure. And so Chevaillier and her mother traveled on the railroad across the country in the summer of 1891 and spent the summer at Fountaingrove. Now, they didn't join the Brotherhood of the New Life. They were just visitors. Chevaillier saw the colonists toiling in physical labor while Harris sat in his study and dictated poems. She saw how Harris controlled all aspects of daily life at Fountaingrove, including, men and women living in separate dormitories. And she saw at one point Harris sitting with his feet in the lap of a female colonist. Some of this started to raise some concerns for Chevaillier. And after she left, after 3 months, she went to Oakland and she started to learn more about Harris. And she got her hands on some affidavits made by some ex-members of the Brotherhood of the New Life who had some pretty shocking things to say. And so in December 1891, Chevaillier launched a crusade to destroy Harris and Fountaingrove. And it started in this San Francisco Chronicle. As you can see the headline here, Hypnotic Harris, Miss Chevaillier's strange story. She runs away from the primate. Now she vows that she will break up the licentious community. She claimed that Harris used powers of hypnotism to control his followers, erasing their free will and using them as slaves. She said they turned over vast sums of money, but it was these sexual practices that she most focused on, and that, as you can see, made it so newsworthy. She said that Harris's claims of celibacy was fraudulent. That in fact, this whole counterpart thing was just a way to kind of give a religious cover to free love, right? She said that counterparts are, quote, permitted by the prophet Harris to descend and take material form in whatever woman Harris may see fit. And so all sorts of unspeakable practices went on at Fountaingrove, according to Chevaillier. Men and women bathing together, unrestrained swapping of sexual partners, including, quote, old men and young women, and young men with old women. Even, she said, quote, a boy of 17 being ordered by Mr. Harris to cohabit, meaning have sex, 6 times a day with a married woman. And to hide such behavior, women who became pregnant at Fountaingrove were, according to Chevaillier, subjected to, quote, kneading and pounding to produce abortion. Is it not most horrible immorality to teach such disorderly doctrines? Chevaillier asked the public. So it started in the pages of the Chronicle, but then Chevaillier gave interviews and wrote pieces for other newspapers, including Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper in New York. And this is like the beginning of what we would soon call the era of yellow journalism. They weren't using that term yet, but this is really the era of the scandal story and the sensationalized newspaper era. That this is really the beginning of it. She also gave talks, including one here in San Francisco on February 16th, 1892. She gave this at Irving Hall, which is literally a stone's throw from where we are tonight. It was at 139 Post Street. The building's no longer here, but that's like just around the corner from where we are here tonight. And you can see the advertisement here. It says, tonight, Irving Hall, Secrets of the Sonoma Eden Unveiled. Startling revelations by Miss A.A. Chevaillier, T.L. Harris, and his spiritual harem. The governor appealed to uproot this den of sensuality. And the Masons called upon to expel Harris from their order. You can see in this advertisement how Chevaillier was drawing on older prejudices that had been around for a long time. So she uses this term primate, which came up in the Chronicle headline as well. That's another word for a Catholic, bishop. She uses the word harem to refer to the women, which is drawing on Islamophobic discourse. And she often compared them to the Mormons. One of the other headlines was worse than Mormons. And the Mormons had just given up polygamy in 1890, right? So they were very much had been in the news for a long time. And she's drawing on anti-Mormonism, anti-Catholicism, and Islamophobia in attacking Fountaingrove. And her claims were explosive. And hundreds, probably thousands, of newspapers in the United States, Great Britain, and throughout the English-speaking world carried coverage of her accusations, and people were fascinated. As the story continued, we saw cartoons added to some accounts, and I don't know who made these cartoons, but you can see here one of them shows Harris speaking to Chevaillier, referring to the vampire ministers, which is what he called the ministers who weren't him, basically, who would suck her dry, And then here you see also Harris depicted wearing kind of a fez, right, like a Shriner fez, and he's drinking champagne and dining on oysters while his followers are toiling away in the vineyards. And here we see another illustration of Harris a little bit later. This was the cover of my book. Oddly, Harris is shown wearing wizard's robes, although he wore very expensive suits in reality. His arms are outstretched. He's got these kind of hypnotic eyes staring out at you in this image from the San Francisco Call. During the scandal, newspapers started referring to Fountaingrove as the Harris cult. As far as I can tell, Chevaillier never used this word cult, but it was used over and over again by the newspapers. And nowadays, historians have access to digitized newspapers in a way that we did not have a generation ago. And what that allows us to do is we can search and study texts in new and sophisticated ways. And so I have been able to pinpoint what I really think is kind of the birth of the modern idea of the cult. And it's actually not first applied to Harris, but it very quickly becomes associated with Harris. So this is, I think, kind of the birth of the modern idea of the cult. And it has to do with this other religious leader of the period, a guy named Cyrus Teed. He would visit Fountaingrove during the scandal. So the two men, Harris and Teed, would become very much intertwined in this story. Teed was another fascinating religious leader. He also, like Harris, was from Utica, New York. Something about Utica. He had utopian societies that he founded. He practiced celibacy, at least officially. Teed had the idea that we don't actually live on the surface of the earth, as we may think. We actually live on the inside of the earth. And when we look up, we're actually looking at the center where the sun is. This is what Teed taught. Well, he had this group called the Korean Unity in Chicago. And he gave an interview to the Chicago Daily Tribune. Teed, unlike Harris, loved publicity and he loved to give interviews. And by the way, Koresh, that word you may associate with David Koresh, right, of Waco, the Branch Davidian fame. There's evidence that David Koresh called himself Koresh after Teed, who also called himself Koresh. Koresh is another name for, it's a Hebrew word for King Cyrus, who's mentioned in the Bible. Anyway, back to 1890, here's Teed. He's giving this interview, and he says, he's asked about Koreshian science, his religion. He says, you can see it over here on the right. Koreshian science is a complete system of cult, he says, universal in its scope. And he's using cult in the old way, right? Devotion, religion, veneration, devotion. But you can see that the Tribune put, in short, a cult as a little subhead, right? A kind of mocking subhead. And as you can see from the title of this piece, Blasphemy and Folly, they were very much making fun of Teed throughout this article. I think this is the beginning of the modern idea of the cult, because this newspaper article was republished by lots of newspapers around the country. And it starts to get used in 1890 and early 1891 in this new sense. But it wouldn't be until the Fountaingrove scandal that you really see cult becoming used in a popular way. And I just pulled 3 examples here, but you can see here, right? The Harris and his cult from the Buffalo commercial. Methods of the Harris cult. This is from Manchester, right, in England. It says here, the Thomas Lake Harris cult, right? San Francisco cult. So this is just 3 examples that I pulled out. But again and again, this concept of the cult is being created week by week as the Fountaingrove scandal kind of expanded internationally. Because he had international followers, this was a big story in Great Britain as well as throughout the United States. I found even India had coverage of this scandal. So what did newspapers mean when they said cult? It was always a term applied by outsiders, right? Even back then, nobody thought of their own religion as a cult, right? No one calls their mom and says, I joined a cult today, right? That's never been true. It's always been a pejorative word for a religion you don't like, right? That's what cult means. And cults were groups that violated religious, cultural, and sexual norms to enough of an extent that they were seen as dangerous, right? And cults were led by cult leaders, figures who seemed to have hypnotic power over their followers, right? And this troubled American ideas of free will, independence, and self-control. Cult leaders, by definition of calling them that, it meant that they deserved surveillance and suppression by authorities and the media. Older terms like enthusiast, fanatic, messiah, prophet, all converged in this new word cult leader in the 1890s. And I should probably mention that no other historian has studied this question. Historians up to this point have assumed that cult means cult. Like until this book, almost no one has tracked kind of the beginning of where this idea of the cult came from. And from the beginning, California was associated. And I do think it's the Fountaingrove scandal that starts that association in people's minds. But California, of course, has a tradition of innovation and being unorthodox in a lot of ways that goes back to the gold rush, right? So Harris didn't create that reputation. That predates this. But I think it helped consolidate it. And we also have to think about immigration from China, and then later Japan and India and Korea. And those immigrants would bring their religious traditions, right? And those Asian religions would give California a unique religious landscape, not to mention, of course, the Catholic presence as well. And so in the 20th century, a lot of the California cults had an Asian presence or element, right? So I'm thinking of things like the Raja Yoga Academy at Point Loma, Shanti Ashrama in Santa Clara County, the Mazdazan Society, in LA. These were all 20th century California cults that had Asian leaders or elements. And as I mentioned, Harris had Japanese followers. And so even this kind of Asian element of the cult starts with Fountaingrove. Harris had met some Japanese men living in Great Britain back in the 1860s. And these Japanese men had been sent under pseudonyms secretly from Japan to London to study British science, technology, engineering, and culture. And Harris met some of these Japanese men, and their funds were starting to run low, and he convinced them to go to New York and join some of his colonies. And so some of these Japanese men, these were some of the absolute first Japanese immigrants to the United States. About 20 Japanese men spent time in his New York colonies. And by the time you get to the 1890s, there's only 2 Japanese men at Fountaingrove. And we can see that their presence is very newsworthy, right? The Chronicle, which didn't put any Fountaingrove colonists other than Harris and one other person in the newspaper, right? They didn't put their images. They put both of these Japanese men in the newspaper. And so we have here on the left is Osuo Rai, a samurai from Japan's Sendai domain. And he ran the printing press at Fountaingrove. And on the right is Kanae Nagasawa, who had been born in 1852. And Nagasawa oversaw the vineyards, the profitable vineyards at Fountaingrove. Now, the newspaper gets a lot wrong, including their names, and they often misspell the Japanese men's names. Here we see another image slightly later of Nagasawa. And the artist here cross-hatched, Nagasawa's face, I think, to make him look especially swarthy. And so when you think about the accusation that there's free love going on at Fountaingrove, and then you think about Japanese men and white women, right? That's when it kind of adds this element of miscegenation or race mixing into the scandal. And I think that's why the Japanese men are so prominently part of the newspaper coverage, because it added this kind of fear of Asian contamination. And if you know anything about the anti-Chinese movement, right, which had culminated in 1882 with the Chinese exclusion law, Japanese immigrants faced a lot of that same kind of prejudice. And in fact, on the issue of marriage and sex, California had banned marriage between white people and Mongolians back in 1880. And that term Mongolian would then be applied to Japanese immigrants, banning them from marrying white people as well. So the scandal's combination of Japanese men and white women in a free love type situation was very explosive. And newspapers portrayed Fountaingrove as Orientalist in other ways. Chevaillier said that Fountaingrove was, quote, no fit place for anyone who had not first been a follower of Muhammad. So again, you can hear this kind of Islamophobia. Even that term prophet draws on older associations with the supposed false prophet, Muhammad, right? The Mormons also had been, for a long time, depicted as Orientalized facilitators of interracial mixing due to their polygamy, right? So the term cult is a religious term, but it's also a racial term. And that's always been true from the very beginning. Ultimately, what happens here is that Harris decides to leave. The heat is on him enough to the point that he leaves not just California, but the United States. Harris goes overseas. Later, he would return to New York City, but Harris would never set foot in California after this, after 1892. His reputation was ruined. He never got charged with any crimes, but his reputation was ruined, and he would be remembered as the granddaddy of the cult leaders. And then once the term cult has been established by 1892, it starts to get applied over and over again, and retroactively against religions that have been around for a long time. So the Mormons now get called a cult in the mid 1890s for the first time. Christian Science gets labeled a cult. Theosophy, spiritualism. This term cult then gets applied retroactively to all of these other older religious groups. All of them became cults. And by 1898, Protestant ministers got in on it. And an Episcopalian named Arthur Barrington, published a book called Anti-Christian Cults. And as you can see here, it's an attempt to show that spiritualism, theosophy, and Christian Science are devoid of supernatural powers and contrary to the Christian religion. And this kind of anti-cult book would become a bestseller going forward to the present day by, Protestant evangelical leaders and writers. Nagasawa, interestingly, would ultimately inherit the Fountaingrove lands. And you can see here, Nagasawa is in the middle of this photograph. He's got one of his grandnephews is there in his lap. Nagasawa ended up inheriting the lands of Fountaingrove, and he became one of the wealthiest Asian Americans of the early 20th century. He continued to run the winery, even through Prohibition, and he pivoted to selling grape juice. And he never had any children, but he brought in a lot of his relatives from Japan, and you can see them here. As you may know, California passed some anti-Japanese laws, the alien land laws in the early 20th century, and this forbade Japanese immigrants from owning land in California. So Nagasawa had never had children, but he wanted to pass the lands. I mean, think about 2,000 acres of Santa Rosa. He wanted to pass this to his heirs, but he couldn't under state law because they were born in Japan. But his grandnephew and grandniece, who you can see here as children, Kasuke Ijiki and Amy Ijiki, he had a plan to pass it all to them. But before he could sell the lands or do a transfer, Nagasawa died in 1934. And the white lawyer who was in charge of his estate sold the lands to a white rancher for $90,000, which is shockingly low, even during the Great Depression. For 2,000 acres, I mean, Harris had spent $50,000 on the undeveloped lands in the 19th century, and it had a huge winery and all these mansions and buildings on it. It was sold in a swindle for only $90,000. And then after the white lawyer, whose name was William Ware, took his fees, Nagasawa's family only received $10,000 total, not each. And to add insult to injury, the lawyer Ware rudely evicted the family from Fountaingrove, giving them only 24 hours to pack their bags and get out. And then when Pearl Harbor happened, Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced removal of people of Japanese heritage living on the West Coast, including Nagasawa's relatives. And so Kasuke and Amy Ijiki and the rest of Nagasawa's relatives were all forced into concentration camps, first assembly center in Stockton, and then Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas is where they went. The Fountaingrove lands, meanwhile, skyrocketed in value, selling for $450,000 in 1956, and then again for $9.6 million in 1979 to a real estate development group called TMI. And TMI subdivided the land, constructing a hotel, golf course, country club, and office complexes, and sold off the remainder of the Fountaingrove lands to developers who built hundreds of private suburban homes. And if you've been to Santa Rosa, the entire northern part of Santa Rosa was the Fountaingrove lands. The only building to survive into the 21st century was a round barn that Nagasawa had built back in 1899. Unfortunately, you may recall in 2017, there was a terrible fire in Santa Rosa, and it burned all of these buildings that were the Fountaingrove lands. But rebuilding commenced quickly, and today the value of these lands, incalculable, surely in the billions of dollars today, that did not go to Nagasawa's heirs. And if you go to Santa Rosa today, and you go to the northern parts of the city, you see Fountaingrove, the name, everywhere. And it's odd, if you know how scandalous the history was, to see this word used over and over again. There's even a Fountaingrove dentistry, which I didn't take a picture of. These are photos I took when I visited. Fountaingrove Lodge, Fountaingrove Center, Fountaingrove Executive Center, Fountaingrove Inn and Hotel, right? A strange sort of misremembering or forgetting happened in Santa Rosa over the course of the 20th century, right? The name Fountaingrove has been stripped of all of its original meaning, and certainly all of its scandalous connotations are gone. And today it just kind of means, wine and, water and nature and, kind of feel-good labels devoid of anything specific. There's even a Thomas Lake Harris Drive in Santa Rosa. His controversial theology has been forgotten. He kind of just stands for feel-good, vague things like utopia and harmony in Santa Rosa today. There's little remembering of counterparts or communal bathing or secret abortions or forced intergenerational sex, which dominated headlines in the 1890s. And Nagasawa also was remembered posthumously. They have a bust of him, which they installed in 1985. And there is a park named after him in the former Fountaingrove lands. He has been cast as an American success story, a way for Santa Rosa to honor its Asian American heritage in a way that I think feeds into the model minority myth of Asian Americans, being somehow different than other ethnic and racial groups, a way of denying the violence of racism. Again, the story of how they did not get the money from those lands is not part of this local story. So let me just conclude here by reflecting a little bit on why cults are still fascinating to us today. From the Fountaingrove scandal onward, the category of the cult has operated as a way to demonize certain groups in terms of religion, race, and sexuality. The category was created by newspaper writers and editors chasing readers, activists like Chevaillier trying to help people, ministers condemning false religions, what they viewed as false religions, and authorities protecting what they considered the public morality. The idea that members of cults are hypnotized or brainwashed, right, to use a more Cold War term that would come later, right, this idea suggests that no one is safe, right? We are fearful of cults because of our vulnerability of ending up in one, right? And we also need cults because it makes religions seem all the more legitimate in contrast, right? So if a cult is fanatical, then a religion is reasonable, right? If a cult is violent, a religion is peaceful. If a cult is authoritarian, a religion must be egalitarian, right? If a cult member believes in weird things, then religious people believe in normal things, right? And if sex and family arrangements in cults are deviant, then sex and family arrangements in religions are wholesome. Now, certainly some groups that have been labeled cults are no doubt abusive, right? There's no doubt that some are violent. There's no doubt that some are authoritarian, but so are some religions. The modern concept of the cult began in the 1890s, grew in power throughout the 20th century, became a public crisis in the 1970s, especially after Jonestown, right? And shows no sign of diminishing today, at least based on the podcasts that are out there about cults, right? Lurking on the perilous margins of religion, sex, race, and nation, cults continue to frighten and fascinate us in equal measure. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, we have time for some questions. Do we want to have any questions here, John?
Just to clarify, it doesn't contradict what you said. Primate does mean usually the head of the church. That's it. The primate of Spain is primate of Ireland, which is actually another art. But the thing about cult is, it's a very respectable term. It still is used, let's say, heavily in Catholic theology, which I was raised in some. And it talks about the cult of this, cult of that.
Mhm.
It was good a Latin term, and I think it's derived from some teachers that they picked up from everybody's practice. So this Fountaingrove I had been reading about, and I had forgotten about the Harris part, but it's an interesting phenomenon. Of course, yes, I've been up in Sebastian with a lot, clearing out my brother's home, and I'm pretty sure I drove by a lot of this.
Yeah, thank you.
It's true. The whole thing of Santa Rosa is just kind of, it's given up on the past. Thank you for your call.
Thank you. I'm visiting Santa Rosa next weekend to do a talk there. So we'll see how that goes.
So for the folks on Zoom, that was more of a remembrance and a clarification than it was a question, because they were asking, what's the question?
Yes.
So is there any truth to these accusations?
Yes.
Why was this woman so intent on
Yes.
bringing
What's
them
the
down?
truth?
So the question is, was there any truth to this? And so this is a great question, which I sidestepped, you may have noticed in the presentation. I don't sidestep in the book. It's a complicated question to answer. And it's partly because studying sexuality in the past is challenging in general, right? It's the sources don't exist that you wish existed, or the sources were destroyed. So it's a very challenging thing to study sexual practices in the past, right? And unfortunately, the affidavits that Chevaillier had burned up in the San Francisco fire of 1906. So I don't have them other than what she fed to the media. However, I've visited every archive related to this story over the last 10 years, and I do think I can answer the question, right? There's not evidence from within the group that there was widespread free love going on. That said, I do think that Harris did abuse his power. I do think that there's enough evidence from women who left, who complained about his behavior, to say that he did abuse his power sexually. Now, can I say that everything that Chevaillier was saying is true? I think a lot of it was probably exaggerated, but I do think Harris, because he had such power over his followers, because they believed he was a pivotal man, because he taught them that their breath kept him alive, because he could separate them from their families and rename them, because he had such power, and taking that into account and what we know about many other religious leaders and many other powerful men in general who abuse their power, I do think that he did abuse his power, in my opinion. But if you want to go through all of the evidence, I spend about half a chapter in the book weighing it and going into more detail. Good.
Whichever one. We'll start in the front and then we'll do two names.
Yeah, what about the fact that cult is the first part of culture?
Yes, that's true. So what are you thinking with that?
I'm just thinking that that may be where some cultures came out.
Yeah, so I'd have to learn more about I know the word cult comes from the Latin kind of origin. So I don't know enough about the etymology to kind of know all of that.
I don't either, but I know about English.
Right. So it is, yes, I mean, it probably shares a root, that's as much as I can.
The OED.
Yeah, we need the OED.
Incredibly fascinating.
Yeah. We probably have it somewhere here, the OED.
Yes.
Yeah, something that confused me was that you said that his followers believed that there was an apocalypse coming and he would save, only his followers from this. why then was his story that they were all celibate? If you save your followers from the apocalypse just for them to die out because they're not having any children,
Well,
what would happen? Like what? He's saving them from going to hell, and then they're gonna die and go to heaven.
the question is about how can he be promoting celibacy officially, right? If he wants his movement to last, and if he's saving people from the apocalypse. He believed to the moment he died in 1906 that the apocalypse was at hand. So he wasn't thinking about the need to reproduce. He was thinking that we were all living in end times. And there were many people in this period who, like William Miller, right, famously taught that we were living in end times until he and his followers were disappointed when it didn't happen. So the great disappointment. So Harris is not unusual in believing they lived in end times. The celibacy was unusual. But I don't think he was too concerned about the long-term survival of his group. And after he died and after Nagasawa died, his movement did die out, right? There are no members of the Brotherhood of the New Life today, right? But there were other groups that were celibate. For example, the Shakers, probably most famously. And the problem with being celibate, if you last long enough, is that then you don't have kids to raise in your religion. And the Shakers were, bring in visitors and proselytized to try to get converts because they weren't having children. So that's a good point.
Well, one more here, and then we'll go to a question on Zoom. Go ahead.
When Harris left the country, where did he go?
He went to Wales. He hid out in Wales, and for a while he planned to buy land in Mexico and relocate from Fountaingrove down to Mexico. And he tried to get some Japanese investors in, and the whole thing went south, so he didn't end up doing it. But he holed up in Wales for a while. Then he went back to New York City and lived mostly in New York City for the rest of his life.
There's a great question on Zoom. A couple people are asking, why did he leave the property to Nagasawa? Like, why him?
Mm-hmm. So I tracked the land purchasing, as you can tell from my talk. I went and spent hours and hours in Santa Rosa going through all the land deeds, right? And I was able to track some interesting things. Harris, when Harris got some heat on him, he decided it didn't look good to have all this land in his own name. So he put it in some of his followers' names. And then later he married, I didn't mention this, one of his followers during the scandal, a female follower. Although he reassured his followers that Lily Queen was still his true counterpart. This was just a marriage of convenience. And then all the lands went into her name. In 1900, they decided to pass the lands over to 5 colonists under a term where whichever one outlives the others inherits it all. And Nagasawa ended up inheriting it all. But Nagasawa had run the vineyard for decades. Nagasawa was one of the most educated, well-traveled people in Sonoma. And Harris thought of Nagasawa as his adopted son. That's what he called him. So he did have a special fondness for Nagasawa. And Nagasawa's diary exists from the early 1870s, and it's fascinating reading his devotion to Harris. He was really struggling to understand, but he loved Harris, and he felt accepted by the Brotherhood of the New Life in a way that a lot of Japanese immigrants did not, find in the United States. So there's some interesting parts there in terms of how the Japanese members were treated, but they generally had equality among the followers.
Let's do another Zoom question, and it's about Harris's family. Did any of them join him in the cult?
For a guy who was celibate, supposedly, he had 3 wives, interestingly, not including Lily Queen, his counterpart. So he had 3 earthly wives. He had 2 sons with the first wife, and they spent time in his New York colonies, but as soon as they could get old enough, they left. And I won't get into too much of into it at the moment, but he had a granddaughter. One of his sons had a daughter who did live at Fountaingrove, and she killed herself. And you can read about that. It turns into a murder investigation, and I talk about it in the book, in 1896. So yes, he does have some relatives, and some of them do spend time in his colony.
What about siblings or cousins or? None of those.
No. He was born in England, but he grew up in Utica. He didn't have, as far as I know, he didn't have any family other than his own children.
And of course, the question then becomes, did any of the ones, children, grandchildren, write about the experience? Is there any?
There is, yes. So there were some of the second generation who wrote some accounts, and I drew on those as much as I could. I can say 100% that there was co-ed bathing going on at Fountaingrove. There's good evidence for that. Harris said that if they could bathe each other without becoming aroused, that was a sign that they'd become spiritually mature. And so that was the goal. Officially. I do have a letter from a member that he talked about giving Harris baths. And so yeah, definitely co-ed and communal bathing was for sure going on at Fountaingrove. So that one I'm 100% sure on.
And Michelle, did you have a question? We'll do the last question here in the audience.
Yeah, did you track down any descendants of Kurosawa?
Nagasawa?
Yeah.
So Nagasawa didn't have children, right? So what we have, yes. So what we have is Kosuke and Amy Ejiki, and they are Kosuke has died. I'm not sure if Amy is still alive or not, but she, would be pretty old at this point. And I did not speak to any of the children of them potentially. That would have been interesting to see. That kind of was the epilogue of the story, was kind of what happened to the lands and stuff. But that would have been a good idea. That would have been interesting to see. I did read interviews of the family, so there is some interviews out there where they are talking about their family memory. They remember being robbed of all this land and all this money. It's something that they for sure haven't forgotten.
Did they move back that year?
No, they came after Arkansas. They came back, and I think we're in Southern California last I saw. But I know that Kosuke has died for sure. I'm not. If Amy's alive, she's quite old at this point. Yeah.
So a question I think that I definitely want to know how did you get turned on to this story? What made you write this book?
I probably should have started with that.
You can end with
The question is, how did I get interested in this story? I was at UCLA. I was taking an American West seminar. I had to come up with a research topic. And I've always been interested in religion and interesting religions and weird religions. And I was looking into California history because that's what I wanted to focus on. And I saw in a book called California's Utopian Communes, I saw a mention of the Fountaingrove stuff. And the scandal gets one page. And I thought, that sounds interesting, right? You've got the Japanese members, you've got the media, and I started to research it. And then I put it aside and wrote my dissertation, which became my first book, American Heathens. But I'd always sneak time for this project when I was in the archive because I was still fascinated with it. And it just was the story that kept giving, because then I discovered Chevaillier's background, and she was from Christian Science, and the Theosophists get involved, and the Swedenborgian Church, and the spiritualists, and it just became this way to bring in all of these 19th century religions into one story, and it created the cult. So it was the concept of the cult. So it just was something I just became utterly fascinated with and spent more than a decade working on. So thank you all for having me here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in the camera view. So we do have copies of the book here. If you're interested in checking it out and having it signed, Josh is going to be sitting over here. If you're interested out there on Zoom, we'll be sending out an email tomorrow about how you can buy the book. If you do want a copy of it signed, text me or email me right now, and I can probably get one for you before Josh leaves today. But thanks everyone for joining us here in the club rooms and for joining us on Zoom for this program. We hope you'll join us for another book club program in the near future. You can check out all of our programs online at bccbooks.org/programs to register for any program. You can email us at programs@bccbooks.org. You can email me. I'm Kevin at bccbooks.org. You can call us. Just come to a program. Let us know what you want to see. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon.